They were kings and queens, adorned in jewels wrapped in silk, and crowned by God. But beneath the gold, their bodies rotted. Syphilis wasn't just a disease. It was a curse that infected empires, drove rulers mad, and left royal bloodlines trembling. Today, we uncover 7 royals, powerful, beloved, and damned, whose downfall was written not by fate, but by infection. They called it the French disease, but by the time it finished its work, every crown in Europe was touched by the rot. What you're about to hear includes graphic historical descriptions of disease madness and royal decay. Watch until the end to understand how a single infection reshaped history itself. Before we descend into Europe's most cursed bloodlines, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. Number 1. King Charles VIII of France. He was born in 1470, the son of a ruthless king and the shadow of a dying dynasty. Charles VIII of France came into the world with a twisted jaw and a soft voice crowned not by war or wisdom, but by the silence left behind when his father died. He became king at just 13. No one expected greatness, only obedience. But Charles had dreams, not of France, but of Italy. He devoured tales of Roman conquest, ancient marble golden cities, and saw himself as a second Caesar. In 1494, at the age of 24, Charles launched his grand invasion of Naples. His armies stormed the south, trailing banners and blood. And though the campaign was swift, it carried home more than loot. What returned with them was rot. Syphilis, new to Europe, erupted in the ranks. It devoured flesh-cracked skulls, collapsed noses, peeled skin from groin to face. The soldiers called it the Naples disease. The Neapolitans called it the French disease. Either way, it followed Charles home, and it did not forget him. Court whispers claimed the king began to change. His eyes dimmed, his temper shortened. His face, already deformed, seemed to sag further, as if his very bones were softening. Chronic fatigue headaches, swelling signs that today's doctors recognize as early syphilitic infection. Charles's mind, too, began to fray. No more Roman dreams, only confusion, dark moods, and strange detachment. He was retreating into himself, and perhaps into madness. Then, in 1498, came the final blow. While watching a game of tennis in Amboise, he struck his skull on a stone doorway. Hours later, he collapsed and died. He was just 27. He left no heir, his bloodline gone. But the disease lived on. Charles VIII didn't just die young. He became the first royal vector of a continental plague. The infection his army carried home would go on to invade popes' queens, dukes, and countless dynasties. A boy king who tried to wear the armor of Caesar, but instead crowned syphilis. His bones rest beneath stained glass, but the rot he unleashed never stopped crawling. He ruled for 15 years, and for 500 after the disease, he carried haunted every throne. Number 2. King Edward IV of England. He was born in 1442, tall, handsome, powerful beyond his years. Edward IV of England rose from the ashes of civil war. At just 19, he seized the crown during the Wars of the Roses and was hailed as the warrior king of the House of York, a man whose sword seemed blessed by destiny. And yet, it was not the battlefield that undid him. It was what coursed through his blood. For most of his reign, Edward was the image of virility. He drank, he danced, he seduced noblewomen and commoners alike. His mistresses filled an entire chapter in court gossip. But even the body of a lion can rot from within. In the final years of his life, the change came suddenly. His once imposing figure grew bloated. His breath was labored. His skin, once flushed with life, turned pale and patchy. He became irritable, withdrawn. Records speak of boils, ulcers, and a sickness of the loins that no physician could cure. Historians have long debated the cause of his death in 1483, at the age of 40. But modern paleopathological studies, examining bone lesions and written accounts, suggest an unsettling possibility: syphilis. If true, it would make Edward IV one of the earliest known royal victims of the disease in Europe, even before Charles VIII's campaign in Naples. A case so early, it rewrites the timeline of infection. and the symptoms fit. Syphilis, in its tertiary stage, attacks the brain, the heart, and the skin. It creates sores, swelling, rage, confusion. Edward's sudden weight gain, emotional volatility, and skin disorders align all too well. But what makes Edward's case even darker is the legacy he left behind. His premature death triggered a succession crisis. His young son Edward V never ruled. Instead, his brother Richard seized the throne, locking the two royal boys in the Tower of London, where they vanished. Edward's decay, physical and political, fractured the House of York and opened the door for the rise of the Tudors. He was supposed to unite a broken kingdom. Instead, he passed on a kingdom infected with betrayal, disappearance, and perhaps disease. Edward IV didn't just die, he unraveled, and in his wake, he left a mystery of rotting flesh, silenced heirs, and a throne tainted with blood. His tomb lies in Windsor Castle. But what lingers is the possibility that syphilis didn't just kill a king. It killed a dynasty. Number 3. Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino. He was born in 1492 into wealth, power, and beauty. Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, carried the name of a dynasty that had shaped the soul of the Renaissance. His grandfather was Lorenzo the Magnificent. His bloodline fed artists, poets, and popes, and in him Florence placed its fragile hopes. He was tall, graceful, and impossibly refined. He studied the classics, wore Milanese silk, and lived like a marble statue brought to life. But Lorenzo's story was not carved for eternity. It was carved for rot. By the time he reached 24, Lorenzo had become Duke of Urbino, more a title than a throne. His military campaigns were short and unimpressive. He preferred banquets to battlefields, and his nights were crowded. Rome, Florence, Venice, wherever Lorenzo went, desire followed. But so did disease. In late 1519, just weeks after his wife gave birth to a daughter, the future Queen Catherine de Medici, Lorenzo fell violently ill. The physicians were silent. The symptoms were not. His body blistered, his groin ruptured, his mind fractured, fever, seizures, disfigurement. And then, nothing. He died in his palace at the age of 26, his flesh collapsing faster than any war had ever broken him. Official records called it an internal sickness. But internal to what? Modern historians point to syphilis, then ravaging Italy, passed from court to court, like a whisper. Lorenzo, young and reckless, had every chance to catch it, and every symptom matched. But this isn't just the story of a man. It's the story of a lineage infected. His daughter Catherine, born just before his death, would go on to marry into the French throne, bringing Medici ambition to Paris, and perhaps Medici blood corrupted by disease. And so the rot did not stop at Lorenzo's grave. It passed into history, into royal beds, into crowns. Lorenzo was supposed to be the rebirth of Medici strength. Instead, he was its final candle burning out in fever, filth, and whispers. His tomb in the Medici chapel gleams with white marble. Michelangelo carved his likeness into stone, eternal, serene. But stone cannot tell the truth. It cannot show the sores, and beneath the polished image, the worms still wait. Number 4. Ferdinando de Medici, Grand Prince of Tuscany. He was born in 1663, heir to wealth, power, and indulgence. Ferdinando de Medici was the Grand Prince of Tuscany, firstborn of Cosimo III and future ruler of Florence. He was raised beneath golden frescoes, taught by Jesuit scholars, and bathed in music, marble, and incense. He was everything a prince should be: cultured, charismatic, and adored. But beneath the powdered skin and powdered wigs, his flesh had begun to rot. From a young age, Ferdinando showed signs of brilliance. He studied philosophy, commissioned operas, and threw lavish banquets where poets and prostitutes shared wine in equal measure. His palace in Pratolino became a shrine to sensuality, music by Corelli, verses by poets, and a garden of forbidden pleasures. And in those secret salons something crept in: syphilis. The infection came quietly hidden behind perfumes and rouge, a sore that did not heal, a rash mistaken for exhaustion. a flicker in the eye that blurred into darkness. But by his late 20s, the mask began to crack. Ferdinando's once charming smile grew stiff. His appetite waned. He drank to forget the pain, then drank because he couldn't stop. His fingers trembled. His voice slurred. His mind fragmented. Court physicians used vague terms: nervous weakness, melancholy, humoral disturbance. But modern historians are more direct: neurosyphilis. The final stage: he was no longer the Grand Prince. He was a ghost, a creature who wandered candle-lit corridors, mumbling in Latin, bleeding from the gums, and screaming in his sleep. Women avoided him. Servants feared him. His body stank of rot. He died in 1713 at the age of 49, raving, swollen, and alone. He left no children, no legacy, just a marble tomb, and whispers that the glory of the Medici had died with him. His father, Cosimo III, declared 3 days of mourning. But behind the drapes the courtiers celebrated. The last great prince had fallen not in war, not in betrayal, but to a disease passed between silk sheets and lies. Ferdinando loved beauty, but in the end it betrayed him, and syphilis took its revenge. In the language of decay. Number 5. King Henry VIII of England. He was born in 1491, a golden boy, destined for the church, not the crown. But fate shifted, and so did the bloodline. When his elder brother Arthur died, Henry VIII became heir to the throne, and to a legacy that would burn England to its roots. At his coronation in 1509, he dazzled the world, tall, athletic, brilliant in languages, theology, and war. A true Renaissance monarch, a second Solomon, a lion with a crown. But by the time of his death, that lion had become something else. Bloated, paranoid, covered in ulcers, feared more than adored. And for centuries, historians have asked what happened to Henry. Many point to his injuries, his ego, his obsession with male heirs. But others whisper of disease: syphilis. Though never confirmed in royal records, as court physicians were masters of omission, Henry's late-life symptoms are disturbingly aligned with advanced neurosyphilis. Sudden rages, compulsive sexual behavior, rapid cognitive decline, a festering leg wound that would not heal, oozing pus and stench. His skin became mottled and pale. He suffered insomnia, depression, and emotional volatility that terrified his court. And perhaps most tellingly, the women. 6 wives, 2 executed, still no surviving son until late in life. And even then, his heir Edward died young. His desperate obsession with fertility, combined with repeated miscarriages and stillbirths from his queens, suggests not just random tragedy, but venereal infection, passed silently, repeatedly. Behind the silks and ceremonies, something was festering. By the 1540s, Henry had become nearly unrecognizable. He weighed nearly 400 pounds. He could not walk. He screamed at shadows and accused friends of treason. He slept alone, isolated in cold chambers with his leg wound rebandaged daily as it bled through linen. He died in 1547 at the age of 55, swollen, broken, and raving. His final words: "Monks, monks." Was he haunted by the abbeys he destroyed, or the rot within himself we may never know. But if syphilis did creep through Henry's veins, it didn't just warp his mind. It changed history. His madness led to the break with Rome, the execution of Anne Boleyn, the Protestant Reformation, the rise of Elizabeth, the bloodbath that followed. One infection, one king, and the soul of a nation forever split. His tomb lies in Windsor, sealed in lead, but the question still seeps through time, like poison through skin. Did Henry VIII rot before he died? Number 6. King Philip II of Spain. He was born in 1527 beneath the weight of empire. Philip II of Spain was the son of Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and heir to a world stained in gold and blood. From the Americas to the Low Countries, his dominion stretched farther than any king before him. But with empire came rot, and Philip, for all his piety, was not spared. In his youth he was known for his discipline and cold resolve. He rarely smiled, rarely strayed, rarely touched anything unsanctioned by the church. But behind closed doors, his appetites grew darker. Rumors in the Spanish court, hushed but persistent, spoke of secret mistresses, young courtesans, and symptoms that could not be disguised. Lesions on the mouth, swelling in the groin, sores on the hands. His first wife, Maria of Portugal, died shortly after childbirth. His second, Queen Mary I of England. Bloody Mary died childless, leaving him without an heir on the English throne. By the time Philip reached middle age, his body began to betray him. His legs swelled. His fingers stiffened. He developed chronic facial ulcers, often hidden beneath layers of cloth and incense. He grew paranoid, unable to trust his closest advisors. His skin flaked and split, sometimes bleeding through royal gloves during Mass. These were not the ailments of stress. They were the symptoms of a long-standing venereal infection, most likely syphilis contracted in his youth, now returning as a slow spiritual punishment. Court physicians described him as a king of sores and silence. In his final years, Philip withdrew almost completely. He isolated himself in the monastery palace of El Escorial, a cold granite tomb built while he still breathed. There he suffered in solitude. His legs became blackened with gangrene. He was often carried between rooms on stretchers. His bed linens were burned weekly due to infection. The stench of death was ever present. When he could still write, he scrawled furious letters not about war or politics, but about his pain, his flesh, his guilt. In 1598, at the age of 71, Philip died, slowly rotting from within. But the damage was done long before. His syphilitic decay mirrored the collapse of his empire. Religious wars failed Armada's economic ruin. He ruled the mightiest kingdom on earth. But he could not rule the disease that stripped him day by day of face, flesh, and reason. In death he wore a crown of Christ. In life, he wore a mask to hide the rot. Number 7. Charles II of Naples, also known as Charles the Lame. He was born in 1254 beneath the banners of conquest, but cursed from the start. Charles II, son of Charles of Anjou, was destined to rule Sicily and Naples kingdoms soaked in sunlight and civil war. But his reign would be marked not by victories, but by infirmity. As a young man, Charles was captured during a failed crusade in Aragon. He was imprisoned for years, shackled in cold stone cells, while his father waged war to retrieve him. When he finally returned to Naples, something about him had changed. He walked with a limp. He spoke more slowly. He avoided mirrors. The court called it battle injury. But whispers behind the silk tapestries said otherwise: disease, a sickness not of swords, but of flesh. Mal Francaise, they called it. The French disease. Syphilis. Contemporary descriptions paint a portrait of disfigurement, swelling lesions, difficulty speaking, neurological decline. His court records are filled with absences, fevers, and disturbed humors. His body twisted, his gait deteriorated. His soul, it seemed, dulled. And the name followed him until his death: Charles the Lame. He ruled for 32 years, but rarely appeared in public. Diplomacy was handled through scribes and sons. When he did emerge, nobles recoiled at the sight of him, pale bent, always veiled in incense. His portraits became more symbolic than realistic, idealized saints, with no signs of his withering form. But inside the palace walls, servants watched him decline. He spoke of visions, of voices, of smells no one else noticed. He accused the Virgin Mary of abandoning him. He wept during feast days and refused to eat meat, claiming his mouth was burning from the inside. By the time he died in 1309, at the age of 55, Charles was a hollowed husk, no longer kingly, barely human. His body was so deformed, it was said his death mask had to be modeled from memory, not from life. He left behind a fractured kingdom, a sickly legacy, and a name that erased his dignity. He entered history not as Charles II, but as Charles the Lame. And behind that name, a final rotting truth, that even in the age of crusades and saints, syphilis knew no mercy. It took his walk, it took his face, and in the end, it took his throne. 7 royals, 7 infected crowns, 1 silent executioner. Syphilis didn't ride in on horseback or swing a blade in public. It worked quietly, in bedrooms, in feasts, in nightmares. It took minds before it took bodies. It turned kings into phantoms, queens into mourners, and dynasties into memories. Behind every royal portrait is a hidden sore, and behind every golden seal, a bloodline already dying. If you want more true horror from history's darkest corners, don't forget to subscribe. And remember, sometimes the greatest empires don't fall with a bang. They rot